Okay, so we looked at Plato's dilemma. Plato's dilemma consists in the idea that if you accept that God or some deity is the source of the moral authority of various ethical norms, then it looks as though those norms can't be motivated by reasons. They look arbitrary, capricious, and to some extent immoral. Right? And so it's hard to see why you should feel compelled by those norms or recognize them as good norms other than as threats made by a greater power. In contrast to that, if we look at the deity as making commands that are consistent with the nature of reality, independent of the deity's will, then it looks like what's morally right or wrong is part of reality independent of the deity's authority, and hence moral authority comes from reality as opposed to the will of the deity, and it can be known, understood, and practiced independent of knowing, understanding, or engaging in a specific religious practice. Now we're going to look at other difficulties that philosophers and theologians have raised with regard to divine command theory. So, divine command theory makes, in the case of, for instance, the Judeo-Christian tradition, some biblical passages less problematic. Right? Makes it okay that God did certain things, like send bears to kill children, even though that looks immoral, because if God wills it, it is good. But it also makes other passages look problematic. And so we want to look at why it is that philosophers and theologians have been bothered in this way. So, for example, what does one make of such statements as God is good? Or statements like God's commands are good? Such statements seem to really have no meaning. They're redundant, empty phrases. Right? We'd understand God is good as God does what God wills. And we'd understand God's commands are good as God's commands are God's commands. And that's kind of trivial and meaningless. And that's not how these phrases are thought to be understood in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So it does sort of run against this distinction that we see inherent in a lot of what we read in religious text between the will of God and what is morally or ethically right or wrong. Finally, divine command theory seems to clash with our notions of morality. Specifically, if any action by God is good, no matter how seemingly abhorrent, right, then God could be, from our perspective, incredibly evil and malevolent, while, according to divine command theory, being morally perfectly virtuous. So imagine, right? God decides to torture all of humanity for all eternity, not because of humanity's sins, but merely for God's own amusement. Right? On divine command theory, those sorts of actions would be morally good, because those would be the will of God, and hence they would be morally good on divine command theory. And this seems deeply problematic. Right? The idea that no matter what a deity does, no matter how malevolent a deity acts towards you, their will makes their actions morally correct. That seems, I don't know, what do you want to say, medieval in nature? It doesn't jive with our contemporary conceptions of a moral agency. Of course, not everyone shares that view. Right? So someone like Stewie here might think that God has stumbled upon a great idea. So now it might seem as though rejecting divine command theory is something that we're ideologically compelled to do, and yet it seems terribly radical or unacceptable to people. Now, in Rachel's chapter, he notices that there are other ways in which theologians and philosophers of religion have tried to understand moral authority. And I'm going to take a slightly different tact, and I'm going to point out that there have been other cases in philosophy of religion and theology where our ideological ruminations, our arguments about the nature and existence of God, have run into problems that caused us to revise our conception of that deity. All right? So, for instance, since the Middle Ages, philosophers of religion and theologians have supposed that God's power is limited by logic. Now, they didn't do that originally, but they did it as a result of the discovery of a problem with the nature of omnipotence. And that problem has been known for quite a long time. But one of the sort of more famous incidents of its use and consequences is in a book called Ethics by this guy Benedictus de Spinoza. And he uses this argument in this book, and we'll take a look at the argument, and then we'll see how people reacted to his use of the argument. So the argument is often called the incoherence of God's omnipotence, or just the incoherence of omnipotence. So here's how the argument goes. Premise 1. If God exists, then God is omnipotent. And there are reasons to suppose that this is a reasonable supposition. Right? So if God is supposed to be the author of all existence, then God must have the power to do anything in existence, create anything, destroy anything, etc. So if God exists, God is omnipotent. But if God's omnipotent, then God could create a stone so heavy that God couldn't lift it. Right, so Moses goes up to the burning bush and says, wow, that burning bush is fantastic. It's not consuming itself. God say, can you do this? Could you create a stone that's so large you can't lift it? Now, God could react to Moses' request in one of two ways. Suppose God says, yeah, sure, snaps his fingers or her fingers or its fingers and creates that stone. Then Moses says, wow, that's fantastic, God. Could you lift it up for me now? And God says, no, I can't. I've made a stone that's so large I can't lift. But if that's the case, then there are limits to God's power, and God really isn't omnipotent. And since omnipotence is the central notion in the nature of God, then God probably doesn't exist, because God has limits to God's powers. God isn't God. The other way this could go is that Moses says, hey, God, can you make a stone that's so big that you can't lift it? God responds, of course I can. Because if I made a stone that was so big I can't lift it, then there'd be something I can't do. I wouldn't be omnipotent, since omnipotence is this essential feature of being God. I wouldn't exist. And then God says, oh, shucks. All right? That means there's something I can't do. I can't make that stone, hence I lack power. I'm not omnipotent. It's an essential feature of what it is to be God, so I don't exist. So if God could create that stone, then God's powers would be limited. If God can't create that stone, then God's powers would be limited. If an essential property of God is that God is omnipotent, then if God has limits to God's, if our candidate for God has limits to their powers, they can't be God. And therefore, God can't exist. Now, this may seem like a weird argument, but it's a sound argument. It's got true premises and a true conclusion within the Judeo-Christian tradition, for instance. And so we want to look at how people reacted to Spinoza's presentation of it and how theologians and philosophers of religion have reacted to it over time.